Okay, welcome to another Lit Matters. This time we're focusing on J.B. Priestley's and Inspector Calls and some of the names that he has chosen to give to his characters, some of the connotations and suggestions and hidden meanings behind them. Okay, so start us off then. The title role, the main character, Inspector Ghoul. What is a ghoul? It's a supernatural being, so that in itself lends an element of mystery. Question marks over his existence. Does he actually exist or not? Something, a problem that the play leaves you with at the very end. And some readings of a ghoul are that they're fairly evil, they're fairly nasty, they're kind of evil phantoms that sort of feed off human flesh and go grave robbing. So fairly sort of macabre and morbid, and perhaps those are sort of accusations to be levelled at not Priestley, at the inspector, like he's sniffing around into the death of this poor girl. That's got nothing to do with him. And are there questions that he is to some extent evil, goes bullying this nice, respectable, well-to-do family. Other interpretations, slightly more positive, that the supernatural element lends itself to us thinking of him as maybe some sort of angel sent from a god or a deity of some sort, a guardian angel, perhaps to protect the poor. There's further meanings to this. Ghoul, G-O-O-L-E, spelt as his name is spelt. It is actually a fishing village in East Yorkshire, on the Humber, I think. So there are hints here that the inspector is fishing away for clues, offering bait up to the other characters, and seeing what comes back when he pulls his line in. I think when he throws out the name Daisy Wrentham to Gerald and just sort of watches the reaction, you can see that there. Or perhaps when he shows these various photographs to them, or is it the same photograph? He's perhaps like a fisherman or an angler, just sort of throwing some bait out and seeing if he gets lucky. And that town, it's a port town. It's formerly quite a large industrial port in the Victorian times. Had a huge fishing industry, but then that fell into decline towards the end of Victorian times, and so itself potentially a symbol of the neglected working class, or how they've deteriorated or fallen into disrepair. So there's quite a lot to say about Inspector Ghoul, quite a lot to speculate there. I don't think this is always the case, though, and some of the other characters there's perhaps not. So I think you don't want to overdo it in trying to read too much into some of the characters. Two examples of this are Sheila and Mrs. Birling, and I suppose this makes sense on some levels, that Sheila is comes from is a Gaelic form of Julia or Cecilia, which is from the Latin caecus, meaning blind. And she is blind, certainly at the outset, and has her eyes opened. And similarly connected, a Sibyl was a sort of Roman prophetess, an oracle. But could they really predict the future? Could they really see, or were they blind too? I don't know. There's a danger that you read too much into them, and we're desperate to see things that aren't actually there. And whenever you're using these in an essay or an exam, you got to make sure you don't get sidetracked by them, and don't get make sure you're answering the question, you're addressing the question, you're not waffling on for hours about potential meanings of the name. You just want to perhaps touch on them in passing, or not at all. They're just this video here is just to perhaps show you some of the hidden depths and some of the cleverness to it, or some of the themes and ideas that are of interest to Priestley. Another one which is slightly tenuous, slightly dodgy here, Eric. Why is he called Eric? Yeah. Wow, there's not much. Eiriki, well, that's where the name Eric comes from Norway, from Old Norse, meaning an eternal prince. So like the enlightened heir to the Birling dynasty, like the coming man, the one who's going to inherit it all. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a dig at patriarchy. There's various other places in the text where Priestley is pointing out the stupidity of some of the patriarchy that Eva has to put up with, and perhaps epitomised by Arthur Birling. But it doesn't feel too concrete, this one. Maybe something symbolic about he sort of sees the light, and he gets towards the end of the play and represents perhaps some hope for the future alongside Sheila. and the younger generation, as opposed to their parents. But again, slightly dodgy, that one. Birling, there's not much to be reading into his one, other than that it suggests burly, so he's quite sort of big and bulky, perhaps rather uncaring and unthinking. One name that there is definitely something to be read into is the name of the town where the action takes place, Brumley. That evokes or recalls at Brum, which is a nickname for Birmingham in England, which is situated sort of slap bang in the middle of England, indeed the Midlands, or I guess West Midlands if we're being precise. But it's Victorian times, Edwardian times, something of an industrial heartland, has a history of manufacturing, but crucially it's fantasy, it's invented. It perhaps sounds to Londoners like Bromley, but the point is it doesn't exist, so it could be anywhere. It could be, if Priestley gave it a specific sort of factual real life location, then perhaps some readers would I don't know, feel slightly detached from the action to some extent, and that's not what Priestley wants. He wants us all to be engaging with this, all to be thinking this could happen to a town near us, or to someone we know. So those are some of the connotations of Brumley. Right, starting to get a little bit more definite and concrete. Gerald, slippery, elusive old Gerald. Well, Croft perhaps evokes craft. A suggestion of deceit if you're crafty, or being vulpine, that is fox-like. I think this stacks up. There's a fair bit of evidence to suggest this. For one, he tries to hide his story from the inspector. You know, when he's saying to Sheila, you know, when it's just those two on stage, and he's saying, you know, let's keep this from him. We don't have to tell him. And Sheila's saying, oh, come on, you fool. He knows, you fool. But his instincts are even then to lie and deceive, as well as the fact that he's been lying to Sheila and has been unfaithful to her when he was awfully busy at the works last summer. And we know what he was up to with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton, as he knew her. He also tries to expose the inspector at the end and sort of thinks he's got, I've cracked him. There is no Inspector Gould. I've been a clever sausage. I've been off and done some investigating of my own, and so on. And significantly, he doesn't admit his guilt at the end. There's no, you know, Sheila and Eric are very, very repentant, very remorseful. They get it, you know, in the way that Birling clearly doesn't, and Mrs. Birling doesn't get it and is never going to get it. But Gerald is kind of ambiguous. He's perhaps a bit more with the older generation, and there's not quite the clear expression of guilt that the other members of the younger generation admit to. So kind of fox-like, kind of crafty old Croft. And a croft is in Old English is a fenced off or enclosed area of land. So he and his parents, Sir George and Lady Croft, who are noticeably absent and kind of uncaring. They're not at their son's engagement drinks party at the start of it, which seems a bit off. And Birling puts that down to Lady Croft not being too happy that he's married beneath himself, as it were. But they are very definitely representatives of the landowning aristocracy. You know, perhaps uncaring, perhaps absent. Okay, on we go to the principal character. Even though we never see her, she's never on stage. Arguably the most important, and certainly the most going on with her name, or both of her names. Firstly, Eva, just like Daisy, was a very common female name for Edwardian times, and as such she's a symbol for the poor, for every woman, for any sort of ordinary, normal, working class girl. She's not. It's not a fancy name. It's a very common one. Where does it come from? Well, Eva means life in Hebrew, or life-giving. And there's a sort of bitterly ironic twist here from Priestley, because, as we know, she doesn't get to bring life into the world, and as Eric finds out to his horror, and as Mrs. Birling knows when she rejects Eva's sort of appeal to her Brumley women's charity committee, she doesn't get to bring life into the world. She burns at her inside, and that includes tragically her unborn baby. But arguably she does bring life in the sense she brings truth to the others. She brings, Sheila sees the light. She's enlightened, as does Eric, and perhaps the others to an extent. So they indirectly they have a chance of a better life in that they could try again. They could start again and do it right this time and be more compassionate and more empathetic. Eva also recalls Eve, i.e. the first woman, in terms of Adam and Eve in Christian theology. So in that sense, she could be all womankind. She could be any woman, and this could happen to any of us, to any of our mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts, or whatever. And I think what's also significant, if you know your literature and you've read your Paradise Lost, John Milton, one of the most important things ever written in English, even in his epic poem, is something of a rebel as well. She challenges authority and she thinks for herself, and she's not bossed around by Adam or by God, and so she's fine and tolerated until she challenges the patriarchy, and then she gets punished for it. So I think there's echoes there of the Eve in Paradise Lost. In terms of her surname, Smith, well, it is the most common surname in the UK then and now, so she's a symbol of every woman or normal people in that sense. A smith is a maker, as in a blacksmith or a silversmith, a trade working with their hands, and so she represents the working class on that level as well. And then also another perhaps slightly more miserable touch. Smiths were skillful and had a trade, had this craft, this skill of value, which was slightly diminished by the Industrial Revolution and the onset of more machinery and this sort of factory production. These smiths were slightly less in demand, or their trade, their skills were slightly less valued. So, as such, perhaps there's another hint that the Priestley suggesting the working classes are having their skills and their value neglected. Okay, lastly then, her alter ego, Daisy Wrentham. Okay, so very obviously, Daisy is a flower itself, something as a symbol of nature or beauty, and perhaps a symbol of spring and rebirth. She decides to change her name to Daisy Wrentham because she's had enough of being Eva Smith. So she's trying to give birth to herself again, as it were, and try and start anew. But flowers are also a symbol of perhaps innocence and peace, or a suggestion that she's about to blossom, perhaps rather hopeful, but at the same time fragile, easily damaged or easily destroyed by trampling boots of, in this case, capitalism or the aristocracy. And perhaps it just evokes that phrase in English, pushing up the daisies, which means someone who's dead, if they're 6 feet under, they are pushing up the daisies, kind of literally, and also in terms of perhaps their nutrients. All these dead bodies are giving life to the daisies and the flowers. But so there's a name that symbolizes a certain amount of death and decay. Right, surname then, Wrentham. Well, rent means for sale, for hire. You rent something out. It's something that is used significantly in exchange for money. And I think here you see with Daisy, Priestley's making a point. She's not, her interactions with Gerald or her interactions with Eric, it's not sort of prostitution, but it as such, a sort of straight up, but it's slightly, it's in that direction. I think Priestley's highlighting that there are very few options to a girl in her situation at this time, pre-welfare state, and that she is dependent on men in the world who have that power, who have that money, who have that property. In the case of Gerald Croft and his chum, who's got a set of rooms in Morgan Terrace. So she's sort of not an out-and-out prostitute on the game, as it were, but she's symbolic of those people who fall into that world where they have very few options to sustain themselves. So rent as well also means something that is torn or broken into pieces. If it's rent asunder or rent in twain, very much like her life, which is broken into pieces or torn apart. So there's lots and lots of hidden meanings for Eva or for Daisy Wrentham. Right, that's about your lot then. Okay, I hope you liked that. I hope you learned something from it. Like I say, I wouldn't spend too long talking about these in exam essays or in essay questions. But I think they are of use to refer to in passing. They'll show you the depth of your knowledge and insight to a text, and they'll perhaps make certain aspects of the characters and the plot easier for you to remember. Okay, don't forget to like or subscribe or leave a comments, perhaps with some of your requests, and I'll see what I can do. Okay.
Pressure.